Greetings, Chess Meal viewers. So today we have a very special Sunday study video for you, in which we are going to be discussing the Philidor position. Just to introduce myself, I'm okei. I stream mainly Crazy House commentating on the great players of the game on leechess.org, and you can see links down below. But I also do some chess study streams as well. And you can also there find links to the page about Philidor, and also indeed this study, which I'm going to be examining with you today. So before we begin, just to share the three Philidor positions. This is the first Philidor position. This is the second Philidor position, and this is the third Philidor position. But before we go into them, let's tell you a little bit about Philidor. So he was this great chess player in the 18th century from France, and he published a book called L'analyse du jeu des échecs in 1777. And he played a lot in Paris and in London, and he is famous for the saying, "The pawns are the soul of chess. Bien jouer les pions, ils sont l'âme des échecs." So he was the first to really recognize the importance of pawns and the importance of pawn structure in a way that some players before him would play in a much more attacking, aggressive style, gambiting pawns for activity of the pieces. So as someone writes, Philidor's book in 1777 was the very first to give detailed annotations on how to play the middle game, to present chess strategy as a whole, and to present the concepts of the blockade, prophylaxis, positional sacrifice, and mobility of the pawn formation, the importance of passed pawns, and so on. But the three positions we're going to discuss today are all going to be endgame studies, for which he's famous for. And the first one is the one most likely to come up in your games. And it's white has a rook and a pawn against black's rook. White is going up the board, but it's black to move. Now, just as a general theme of this kind of position, if you are the defending side against the passed pawn, you should always run your king to be in front of the passed pawn. The best defender against the passed pawn is the king, not the rook. And getting your rook behind the passed pawn if you're white or black is often a good strategy, but in this case white is hoping to deliver a mate on the back rank. Okay, so the move for black in this position to defend is rook to g6. And the idea is simple. It's to cut off the white king so white can't deliver checkmate on the back rank. Okay, so what is white going to do? Now, the black's king is already controlling the queening square. So if it were earlier in the endgame, white's strategy would be to try and cut off the black king from getting to this square. Since black's king is already in a very good position, black can in fact hold the draw with this move, rook g6. Now this is also called the third rank defense, and basically white can't make progress. He can't advance his king. He can throw in a few checks, but he can try and chase that rook, but the rook can just move up and down, and there's no progress that can be made. So at some point he just has to bite the bullet and push the pawn. And now is the key moment in the Philidor position. The third rank defense has been broken. The pawn disrupts the third rank defense. So the key move is rook to g1, and you switch up. Instead of shuffling up and down the third rank, you're going to start checking the white king from behind. And what we'll see here is that the white king actually has no shelter. So really there's nothing that white can do. At some point, if the white king gets too close to the black rook, this pawn then becomes weak and is lost. Okay, so going back to the original position, maybe the best try for white would have been to try and interpose his own rook on the third rank. Now notice if he does it in this position, we can just takes, and we are controlling the 3 squares in front of the passed pawn. So this is now a draw. So the key in this position is you must control the square in front of the pawn. And at the moment the king is next to the pawn, you take the opposition. The opposition is when you're directly 2 squares in front of the other king. So, and now it's very important not to go either side. You must drop back, and whenever the king pops its head, if the king goes here, you go here. But the moment the king pops his head up from alongside his pawn, it's very important you take the opposition, and then this will be stalemate, and so a draw. So black secures a draw. So the first Philidor position is how to draw with only a rook against a rook and a pawn. Now suppose the position was just a little bit more tricky and the king, say, was here and the other rook was here. This is a slightly more tricky variation of it. Now the rook is still cutting this third rank, but now taking would be a mistake. And it's not a mistake because white could take with the pawn, because then we control the square in front of the pawn and we're very good. No, white takes with the king, and notice we're not controlling the square in front of the pawn. So even though we could take the opposition is no good and white is queening. The reason the opposition is no good, by the way, is because after this move, here, and push, we don't have a square behind this 8th rank to drop the king back to. If there was a square if there were a 9th rank, we could drop the king back, and the moment the king popped up, we could take the opposition again, and then it would be a draw. So this is the reason why the pawn on the 5th rank, the pawn on the 6th rank, is actually winning, even though we have the opposition. So even though we have the opposition, if the pawn gets to the 6th rank, it wins. Okay, so the idea of the Philidor position, we simply control the 6th rank. Okay, now we just now Philidor, as we saw, was from the 18th century. Now it turns out there was a guy in the 15th century called Lucena from Spain, and if black plays the wrong move here, if instead of rook g6, instead he plays rook d1 check, then it's possible for white to get into the Lucena position, and this will in fact be a win for white. And the whole key of this position, in fact, is this square here. The reason why rook g6 is the best move is because it controls this square. And the reason why this square is very interesting is not only does white have mating threats, but it's also in the shadow of this pawn. So the moment the king moves here, there are no checks from behind, but also the black king, remember, can't go to the one square which is important to stop the pawn queening, because otherwise there'll be checkmate. And you might say, well, it could go there anyway and block with the rook. But this doesn't work, because white controls the queening square and can just simply push this pawn to queen. So, in fact, if we check the king and the king gets to this key square, our black king is actually going to be evicted from its very nice position controlling this queening square. Check, again, we can't block with the rook, we just have to move the king out. So we can try and do what we... Okay, now, probably the best defense for black is this. Now, the idea of this move is the king is trying to blockade these three squares, keeping the king in front of its own pawn, and using the rook, we're going to blockade this file and keep the king in front of the pawn. So it's very important to do that, because suppose black were to go rook c2, then white's strategy for winning is in fact very easy. He could simply go here, and just now there's nothing attacking the pawn, so you can just simply run his king up the board, and if black tries to stop the pawn queening, it queens anyway. So it's very important not to stay. It's very important for black not to play, not to keep the rook on this file, to actually try and trap the king on this square. So this is black's only hope to try and win this, to try and draw this position. And we now arrive. White does have a winning technique, and the winning technique is to create a bridge, and this is called a Lucena position. So I'll first show you how things could go wrong. Suppose he tries to make a bridge like this. Not like that, like this. So suppose black plays a slightly tricky move and puts the rook on c2 behind the pawn, inviting the king to come out. The king comes out, you check it again, and then white forms a bridge. So this is the Lucena position misplayed because you formed a bridge, but the black king is too close. It attacks the pawn, you defend the pawn, and it's stalemate. So, in fact, in this position, the best move... so rook c2 is a tricky move. Rook b4 would be another way. It would be another way of... would be trying to keep the white king trapped. And so white can still win this. So we're going to show rook h4. Rook h5 also works, but you have to be careful about about driving this black king further away from this pawn. And the way you're going to do that is by checking it. And black has got two squares. I mean, he can either move his king towards the pawn, which on the face of it, that might seem scary because then the rook could come here and pick up the pawn. But it's not, because there's no time. If you try and come behind, we promote. If you try and get some kind of checkmate, our rook is positioned perfectly to block any ideas. So if you try and stay near the pawn, that's what happens. If you go away from the pawn, then we then start to form this bridge, and we can queen, in fact, in this position. But sorry, not a bridge. You have an escape square here. So actually, another thing black could do is just to try and control this square here. But we're going to form a bridge. So the technique is to form a bridge. Now I'll just show you the technique for forming a bridge. You should bring your rook back to the 4th rank, not the 5th rank. The 5th rank is, there's some tricky ways where the king is too close. Okay, so you bring it back to the 4th rank because then the rook can't be harassed. Okay, and that's very important for black to try and keep this white king trapped. Okay, so how does white win this position? Okay, so firstly, he drives the king away. And as we saw, if the black king goes here, we just go here and promote. So he has to go like so. And now we have a square to get our king out. But this means our king is prone to checks. So we come out again, check, and we go here. Notice we're maintaining our guard of our pawn. Checks again, We go here, and when he checks here, we form the bridge. So this is the classic bridge in the Lucina position. The king is too far away to do anything. Takes, and we promote. Now, if black is being very tricky, he won't deliver that check. Instead, he'll attack our rook. In which case, what we're going to do is we're going to move our rook up to the 5th rank, and then we're going to form the bridge on the 5th rank. And this is actually a really beautiful picture. So you have the pawn and the rook defending the pawn, enabling it to queen, and the rook doesn't have checks from behind because there's this little cave that the white king can hide inside. So any checks you can hide, nothing you can do. Okay, so this is the Lucina position, and it would come up if black misplayed the Philidor position. He should play this, cut off the white king. If he misplays it like this, then this happens. Now, worth just pointing out briefly, what if, in the original position, what if it were white to move? And one idea white might have, and I can't do it because, is rook h6 to try and stop the 3rd rank defense. But notice that the whole point of the 3rd rank defense is to stop the white king coming in front of the pawn. So if the rook did go to this square, actually the best defense for black is just to liberate his king from the back rank and move his king up to c7 here, and that will do. That will stop the king from advancing to this key square. And if white checks again, then we drop back again. So the reason why we're going rook g6 is because it guards c6. As a final quick note, there's something very tricky. There is actually another drawing move in this position, which is not recommended at all, but interesting. It can be that the white king actually gets to c6, like so, but black still has a miraculous defense. Now you would never volunteer this kind of position, but it turns out king b8 is the only move that maintains the draw in this position, and you run here. And you're using the rook to pen in the king here, and you're using the king to pen in the king here, and so the king is trapped in front of its pawn. And then you swing across and give checks from the side. The point being that if at any point the king moves away, we'll be able to move our own king in. So I'll just show you. So check, check. We move our own king in, attacking the pawn. Check, check. And there's no way of avoiding the checks. If he advanced the pawn, we could just take it. So the point is, so our king has got this sort of great position, so it can come in and attack the pawn if the king moves out. He can't avoid the checks unless he comes up here. But then if he comes back up here, we then switch back to checking from behind. And the only reason why we win this position by the skin of our teeth is we're controlling the square in front of the pawn with our king. So the moment he goes there, we go back. If he goes here, we go in front of the pawn, and now we have the defense we saw earlier, checking from behind. But in this case, we would just pick up the pawn. So okay, so that's really advanced stuff, really tricky. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this discussion about the Philidor position and how when it's misplayed, it goes into the Lucina position.